Okay, so let's introduce our next author, Dame Agatha Mary Clarissa Christie, who writes our next story, The Murder on the Orient Express. So, Christie wrote 75 novels, 66 detective novels, 14 short stories. She's perhaps the world's most famous mystery writer and one of the best-selling novelists of all time. Her works are reportedly outsold only by Shakespeare and the Bible. She has kind of her own mystery in her own personal life. And in 1926, Agatha Christie disappears for 11 days. The famed murder mystery writer was in the midst of a divorce from her first husband, Archie Christie, and she was dealing with the aftermath of the death of her mother. December 3rd, she left her home, and the next morning her car was found abandoned nearby. She eventually returns, doesn't say much, can't really remember where she was. It's never quite been figured out. So, mystery writer has her own mystery. She creates a detective character, Hercule Poirot, and he is from Belgium, the country of Belgium. And he was a police commissioner who turns detective. So, Poirot is one of Christie's most famous long-running characters. He appears in 33 of her detective novels, a couple of plays. She also wrote a couple of plays, and about 50 of those short stories that were published between 1920 and 1975. So we have Poe, we have Doyle. Now, Christie is our most contemporary author of the three. And the language in her text is very much modern, much easier read than both Poe and Doyle. Very much contemporary in her writing style. Poe has some description. Doyle goes into great length of description. Christie goes even further from a more feminine approach. And we'll see the differences as we read on. So her main character, Hercule Poirot, has been portrayed on radio, film, television by various actors. Poirot's name was derived from two other fictional detectives of the time. A detective named Hercule Poirot and Frank Howell Evans, Monsieur Poirot, who was a real retired Belgian police officer who was living in London. The more obvious influence on early Poirot stories is that of Arthur Conan Doyle. In Christie's autobiography states, "I was still writing in the Sherlock Holmes tradition, eccentric detective, stooge assistant, with a Lestrade-type Scotland Yard detective, Inspector Zapp." For his part, Conan Doyle acknowledged basing his detective stories on the model of Edgar Allan Poe's C. Augustin Dupin and his anonymous narrator, and based his Sherlock Holmes on Joseph Bell, who, in the use of logic, prefigured Poirot's reliance on his little gray cells. And we hear Poirot speaking about his little gray cells just as a reference back to both Sherlock Holmes and Dupin's logic and deduction. Poirot first appeared in The Mysterious Affair at Styles, published in 1920, and exited in Curtain, published in 1975. So we've got about 50 years worth of Hercule Poirot. Following the latter, Poirot is the only fictional character to receive an obituary on the front page of the New York Times. By 1930, Agatha Christie found Poirot insufferable, and by 1960, she felt that he was a detestable, bombastic, tiresome, egocentric little creep. Yet the public loved him, and Christie refused to kill him off, claiming that it was her duty to produce what the public liked. So here again, two authors want to kill off their main character. They're tired of writing about the subject, but the public says, no, we want more. Captain Arthur Hastings' first description of Poirot. He says he was hardly more than 5 feet 4 inches, but carried himself with great dignity. His head was exactly the shape of an egg, and he always perched it a little on one side. His mustache was very stiff and military. Even if everything on his face was covered up, the tips of his mustache and his little pink-tipped nose would be visible. The neatness of his attire was almost incredible. I believe a speck of dust would have caused him more pain than a bullet wound. Yet this quaint, dignified little man, who I was sorry to see now limped badly, had been in his time one of the most celebrated members of the Belgian police. Poirot is extremely punctual. He carries a pocket watch almost to the end of his career. He was also particular about his personal finances, preferring to keep a bank balance of £444, 4 shillings, and 4 pence. One of the more famous actors who played Poirot, David Suchet, who played Poirot on television, said, "There is no question he's obsessive compulsive. He enjoyed finding the sort of obsessive compulsiveness in Poirot. He mentioned in Curtain and the Clocks, he was fond of classical music, particularly Mozart and Bach. Poirot's investigative techniques assist him in solving cases. For in the long run, either through a lie or through truth, people were bound to give themselves away. At the end, Poirot usually reveals his description of the sequence of events and his deductions to a room of suspects, often leading to the culprit's apprehension. Between the world wars, Poirot traveled all over Europe, Africa, Asia, and half of South America, investigating crimes and solving murders. So that's a little bit about Agatha Christie and her writing of her main character, Hercule Poirot. Now, she comes up with the idea for him because during World War I, there were a lot of refugees from Belgium who had escaped Europe and gone to Europe. And in her little town, there were several, I guess you'd call it like a refugee camp for these Belgians. And it was encouraged by the English to become friendly with them, which she did in her home little town. And this is how she comes up with the idea of a Belgian detective. So that's a little bit about Agatha Christie, and we will move on to the next slide, which kind of sets the background in our story, The Orient Express, although under a different name called the Daisy Armstrong murders. It's a direct reference to a real crime, kidnapping of a young child, 20 months old, of the famous aviator, Charles Lindbergh. True story, happened in New Jersey. Again, just like Poe, relating back to a real-life crime in New York City of Marie Rogers. Again, going back to Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, his true historic events of the Mormon exodus from Illinois to Salt Lake City, intertwining these real-life events into a fiction story. Okay, so we'll move on to our next slide from here.